Today, I'm going to be talking about repeater classifiers and what they can tell us about nominal structure. Most of the data for this presentation will be from Shan, which is a Southwestern Tai language of Myanmar. So Shan is a numeral classifier language, meaning that classifiers are obligatory when a numeral combines with a noun, as in one. So here we have ma, sam, do, and the classifier do is obligatory in this construction. Based on other numeral classifier languages, the structure for one might either be what we see in hypothesis 1, where the classifier first forms a constituent with the noun, and then those combine with the numeral, and the noun then moves to a higher position to get the right word order. And this is what's been proposed for Tai, a related language. Another option is what we see in hypothesis 2, where the numeral and classifier first form a constituent, and then they combine and modify the noun. And this has been proposed for languages like Chol, a Mayan language. So in Shan, there's a set of nouns where the classifier and the noun are actually identical in form. I'm going to call these repeater classifiers, and this presentation is about what these repeater classifiers can tell us about the nominal structure of the numeral classifier expressions. These repeater classifiers have been identified in other languages like Thai, Burmese, and Lahu. And while typical numeral classifier constructions have the structure noun, numeral, classifier, these repeater constructions often have the form numeral followed by some classifier or noun, which I'm going to call a reduced repeater form. And examples of this can be seen in 2 through 4. The repeater classifiers tend to denote things like durations, like in 2, which means 2 years, containers like in 3, or political bodies like in 4. For a similar construction to this reduced repeater form, Huang called the word that appears after the numeral a post-numeral lexical item, or PNL, and I'm going to do the same and follow that terminology. You can see an example of a Mandarin Chinese post-numeral lexical construction in 5a here. So this is a numeral followed by a post-numeral lexical item. In 5b is a kind of regular numeral classifier construction that has a noun. And you can see that this is different from the repeater constructions in Shan because the noun looks different from this post-numeral lexical item, and the classifier is also distinct from the noun. So for some repeater classifiers in Shan, they're actually ungrammatical in the unreduced form. You can see that in 6. This is 1, Sam 1, which means 3 days. So that's not very good to say. It's better to say the reduced form, just Sam 1. And that's not true of all repeater classifiers. You can have some like an 8 where the reduced form is optional. So you can either have the unreduced form or reduced form. And I'm not going to talk very much about why some of these repeater classifiers might require the reduced form, and some might just have it optionally. That's something for future work. So what I'm going to propose is that repeater classifier constructions in Shan show evidence to support the structure in 9, which involves deletion of the noun phrase complement of the classifier when the classifier and noun phrase are identical. Another possible structure is the one in 10, where there's just no noun underlyingly. But I'm going to argue that both of these structures are actually most compatible with hypothesis 1, where the noun and classifier first form a constituent together. So this is related to the typology of noun and numeral classifier semantics, which has been talked about a good deal in the past. And the diagnostics used here can be applied to other classifier languages. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to go through the reduced repeater data. I'll give an analysis and then conclude. So first, what I want to show is that the reduced repeater construction is referential. What I mean by that is that it's used to refer to individuals and not just to like an amount or a measure. So we can see that in 11 and 12. So in 11, we have the reduced repeater construction Simpson, which means two countries. And this expression is introducing to the two countries into the discourse. These can then be referred back to using the example in 12, which means, so the first example in 11 means in the world there are two countries competing over economics. You can then maybe specify which two countries those are, and then say 12, noun has visited those two countries. And here again, we're using a reduced repeater construction to refer back to the two countries that were mentioned previously. These also demonstrate that the reduced repeater construction can be part of a larger nominal structure. So for example, in 12, the reduced repeater construction is combining with the demonstrative, which is going to be higher in the structure. 13 just gives an example of a different reduced repeater construction that can again refer to specific days in this case and can combine with the demonstrative. If we look at 14, this is evidence to show that the PNL, the post-numeral lexical item, is a classifier. We can see this because it reduplicates in the same way that a classifier does. So in 14 is the reduced repeater construction with a reduplicated word for day. And you can compare that to a reduplicated construction in 15, where the noun, so this is just a normal numeral-classifier expression with a reduplicated classifier. The noun and the classifier are clearly distinct, and it's the classifier that's being reduplicated. And in both cases, this the interpretation is something like each day or each bird. And so based on this, we can see that the reduced repeater constructions have a classifier in the post-numeral lexical position. So next I'm going to explain why this post-numeral lexical item is not a noun. So there are two sort of possible explanations proposed by Simpson Ngo for the Tai and Burmese repeater classifiers, and they adopt the second one. First is that a noun is merged in both the noun and classifier position, and then the identical noun is deleted to topology. And the second is that a noun is merged in the noun position and then moved to the classifier position. So if the post-numeral lexical item were in the noun position or moved from the noun position to the classifier position, we would expect that we would be able to see an adjective modifying this construction. And that's not what we found. So we can see that in the following data. So the preferred way to say 3 days is Psalm 1 in 7. And the unreduced form is not very good unless there's something modifying the expression. So in 16, we have 3 rest days with 1 for rest days. And it's ungrammatical to have the noun missing in this construction. So you see that in 17 here. I tried this modifying word for rest on either side of the numeral and classifier just to test it out, and neither way works. You can see how this structure might work in 18. So here the adjective is a modifier adjoined to the noun. In this structure, it's a head. And we can imagine that the head noun is moved into the classifier position, and then this whole thing may or may not be moved to where it typically does to get the right word order. And with a structure like 18, we would expect that we would be able to see data like 17, which we do not. So based on this head movement analysis doesn't seem to work for Shan repeater classifiers, and additionally, since it cannot be modified by something like an adjective, the post-numeral lexical item must not be a noun. Okay, so next, just to rule out the possibility that this is due to the linear order of the words that the deletion takes place, we can, ask the question of, well, what happens if this topology is taking place when only one word intervenes between two identical words? So you can see the argument here. In one, we assume that the deletion rule is to delete the first word if there's only one word intervening between it and an identical. And then given the string 1, Psalm 1 for 3 days, we would just get the deletion of the first word. And with a string that it has an adjective added, now there are two things that are intervening between the identical words, and so there's no deletion taking place. However, based on that kind of argument, we would expect that if something that intervenes that's not modifying the noun, or rather the numeral and classifier expression, we would expect that deletion would still take place, and that's not what we see. So in 20, you can see I put a word meaning about in between the word for day and the numeral. So about typically appears before the numeral, and it's modifying the number of days, so it's not modifying the noun. And in this case, it's not grammatical to have the unreduced form. You have to have the reduced form in 21. So you can see the comparison of these structures in 22 to 24. So in 22, we have the regular 3 days with the reduced form, with the first noun deleted. In 23, we have the modified rest days that's not deleted, which has now there are two things intervening between the identical forms. And in 24, we have a slightly different structure, but again, there are two words intervening, and the deletion must take place in this context. So clearly, it's not the number of words that are intervening linearly between the noun and classifier that affects whether we have deletion. So next, this deletion is in fact licensed by an identical classifier and noun. We can see that in 25, it's not great to have an identical, the unreduced repeater form, zum, song, zum, which means two groups. It's better to have just song, zum in this context. However, if you have this classifier, zum, which means groups, with a different noun, like in 26, now it's fine to have the unreduced form. And then even when the classifier is identical to one morpheme in a noun-noun compound, like in 27 and 28, again, we can't have deletion or reduction in this context. So in 27, the word for tree is gonmai, and the classifier used to count trees is gon, the same word, and you can't delete the first gon in this example. And similarly, in 28, when you have, while 25 is not very good with the unreduced zum, song, zum, when you have now the compound zum, lu, ken, which means group of students, it's totally fine to have the unreduced form. So it's the complete overlap between the noun phrase and the classifier that licenses with the reduced form. Okay, so for my analysis, I'm going to say that the data here is due to a type of noun phrase deletion that's caused by the identical form of the classifier. So the form in 6 which is ungrammatical, is reduced to 7 with the structure in 9 here. So the classifier and its complement are identical, so you delete the complement. And for an example like 16, with the modifier combining with the noun, the complement and the classifier are no longer identical, and so it is not deleted. So if we assume hypothesis 1 in the structure 9, the classifier is C combining the noun at some point in the derivation, so it takes the noun as a complement, and it's the identical form of the classifier and its complement that licenses the deletion. So while I think that the structure 9 better accounts for the variation between the reduced and unreduced repeater classifier constructions, the structure in 10 could account for the reduced forms. So this is the structure that just has the numeral classifier combining together. And this is the structure that Huang argued to account for the post-numeral lexical items in Mandarin Chinese. You can see in 30 the Mandarin Chinese data. But what I would argue is that the based on the semantics of the numeral classifier, that hypothesis 1 better accounts for the structure in 10 than hypothesis 2, which is what Huang argued for hypothesis 2. Okay, so the reason that I think that is because with hypothesis 1, it's easier to posit a fused noun and classifier semantics. So you can see the reason for that here. First, if we assume that the hypothesis 1 is true, then the noun and the classifier are going to combine first, and then they're going to combine with the numeral. And then for hypothesis 2, that assumes that the numeral and the classifier combine first, and then they combine. So you can see the some possible semantic derivations for these two types of structures. And you don't need to worry too much about the details, but if we assume the structure in for hypothesis 2, then the at some node in that derivation, the semantics of that is the combined classifier and noun semantics, which is what we would need to have the structure with just the numeral and the classifier. We would want this to be the semantics of the classifier in these reduced repeater forms. Whereas for structure for hypothesis 2, at no point are the noun and classifier forming constituent, so it's a lot harder to combine their semantics together to be able to be a proper argument for this numeral expression. So based on that, I'm assuming that whether you prefer the structure that involves deletion or the structure that is a numeral classifier, hypothesis 1 is going to be the best analysis for repeater classifiers in Shan. So just to conclude, the reduced repeater constructions in Shan have the properties of being referential, being able to be part of a larger nominal structure, and these repeater constructions cannot be modified by an adjective. The post-numeral lexical item itself within these reduced repeater constructions is a classifier and not a noun, and the deletion of a noun is licensed through a structural and not a linear relationship. So on the basis of that, I propose that the Shan numeral classifier expressions has a structure given here in hypothesis 2, where the classifier and noun originally form a constituent, and then that combines with the numeral. For future work, I mentioned that there are certain repeater constructions that can be reduced and some that need to be reduced in certain contexts. And there's more work to be done to identify exactly what that distribution is and why it could be the case that some must reduce and some do not need to. And thank you for listening to my presentation. Here are my references and my acknowledgements.